Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Mr. Dmitry Kosarev, who is the Director of Forensic Services at PwC South East Asia Consulting, with over 28 years of experience. We also have Sebastian Aldeco, who is the subject matter expert at NetGuardians for the APAC region. Sebastian has more than 20 years of experience in fraud and compliance technologies. Let me quickly go over the agenda of the webinar now. First, Dmitry will cover the fraud risk landscape before COVID-19, risks arising from COVID-19, and how to fight fraud in the digital age. After that, Sebastian will discuss NetGuardians anti-fraud solutions and how to detect and prevent fraud with smarter AI. I will then discuss how NetGuardians is working with financial institutions in meeting their needs and addressing challenges. After the presentations, we will respond to your questions and answers. Please use the questions and answers or chat window to ask your questions. So with that, actually, I'll invite Dmitry to go ahead with his presentation, share his thoughts on fraud risk landscape before and during COVID-19. Dmitry, all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shabana, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for your interest in this topic. Myself, I'm working on this topic continuously for long years now, and I don't know if some of you may know that in PwC we are conducting research on fraud risk, and for last 20 years we do a survey which is called Global Economic Crime and Fraud Survey. And in March of this year we published our latest edition, which focuses on some of the trends in the landscape of fraud risk and economic crime, as well as on the trends on how companies and organizations are dealing with this risk and internal controls that they which will be used to detect and to prevent fraud. Obviously, the results of this survey were based on the information collected prior to COVID-19 crisis. And that's why we will have an opportunity to see some trends that we observed just before COVID-19 crisis, and we also share with you some thoughts about what changes or what trends could arise as part of recent events and challenges which are now been going through for some organizations. Shabana, maybe please next slide. Yeah, we start by the focus on what we observed in our latest economic crime and fraud survey. Next slide, please. I think that one of the high-level key findings in our report is that economic crime rate reported by organization rise. We requested organization to comment on whether they experienced any economic crime over the last 24 months period. And as you can see, 42% of organizations in Singapore replied, yes, we experienced. And this is the highest ever percentage observed in Singapore. And now it's very close to the global average, which is 47%. Well, we try to analyze the rationale for this trend, this increase. Obviously, Singapore has a reputation of very safe place, and domestic environment is clearly very safe. And if you look at this graph, since 2009, whatever evolution and movements in the reported economic crime rates clearly followed the global trend, but it was also clearly a gap, where indicating that Singapore is much safer than global average. This gap narrowed in our latest edition. I think that one of the reasons for this narrowing is the fact that today economy, especially with the developing of digital, you cannot live in isolation in a single country. Exposure to global regional risk is clearly important, especially for the place like Singapore with a very intense cross-border exchanges, international commerce. What means that today what we are seeing, it's this globalization impact, this integration into global economy impact, which translates, unfortunately, also not only by economic benefits, but also by increasing risks. Another reason for generally to see an increase in the fraud rate through last 24 months is there are challenging economic environment. I think that last 2 years were relatively challenging from economic point of view. Economy was not growing so fast. In certain sectors, it was clearly a slowdown. And typically, when economy is not good, fraud risk arise. I think that this is also impacted the reported rate. Finally, and this is potentially the good news, which is behind this curve, also it's increasing, is increased vigilance. Typically, when you think about economic crime and fraud suffered by an organization, if detection methods are not very good, the fraud can run for quite a long time. But better is your detection and internal controls method allowing to spot the fraud. This detection will be faster. And during the periods when organization restructures the internal controls, invest more in new detection and prevention methods, this increase and this faster detection translate by more fraud discovered in certain point of time. But it is not because there are more fraud, but this is because just detection is better and less fraud is left undiscovered. I think that this is increased vigilance and contributed a lot to this trend too, together with negative effects which are real increase in the crime occurrence rate. Next slide, please. Yeah, from cost point of view, we also observe that the cost of fraud can be substantial. More than 50% of organizations suffered cumulated fraud impact more than 1 million. And 23% in Singapore reported that over 24 months, altogether, the cost of fraud is more than $50 million for the organizations. Even for the single fraud event, 38% of organizations in Singapore said that it's above 1 million. And for 5% of organizations, single fraud event would translate in a loss of more than $50 million US. What means that it clearly illustrates that for an organization, fraud may be a big financial challenge with a lot of financial value at stake. Also for Singapore, we observe that it's the cost appears to be higher than for global average. And the question is why? I think that one of the impacts behind this statistic is that in Singapore, typically an organization belongs to much wider organizations. There are a lot of subsidiaries of major multinational corporations with transborder operation, with sophisticated operation. And typically, bigger is the corporation, more likely to have a fraud because financial flows are complex, operation are complex, and there are a lot of challenges from control point of view as compared to a smaller size organization focused maybe on mono product, on running in very small size business. It's quite natural. Shabana, next slide, please. I think that one of the interesting trends we observe, and this is clearly a translation of big trends that I already commented on in the beginning, is the changing environment of fraud. Between 2018 and 2020, the typology of fraud risk dramatically changed. 2 years ago, we were observing that there is predominantly internal fraud suffered by organizations. But this situation reversed completely. In 2020, there is external fraud is reported by organization, and the proportion is much higher than internal fraud. Two trends behind it in our view. First of all, there are new types of New types of crime, right? Cybercrime, definitely, it's always on top of newspapers. I think that 2 years ago, talking about cybercrime in Singapore, it was a lot of question, well, how does it occur? In the last 2 years, it was publicly reported incidents of high profile here in Singapore. And I think that today, everybody understands that any organization can be vulnerable to this type of fraud. Customer fraud is the highest fraud by type in Singapore. It's linked to in several businesses and industries. This fraud is predominant, and I think that this is clearly a new trend where customer fraud is a big challenge. I think that for some industries like financial services industry, it was historically a challenge, for example, credit card fraud, or in insurance, like claims fraud. But for some organization, it's on the rise. I think that when we look into more traditional fraud, like procurement fraud, accounting and financial statement fraud, asset misappropriation, we see they are on decline. And potentially there is a result of measures undertaken by organizations which invested more in prevention and in detection of this kind of crime. And this is maybe also why internal fraud decreased and external fraud was on the rise. I think that it also underscores the adaptation of organization to the changing fraud environment. Maybe it may indicate that whenever fast change in fraud landscape occurs, organizations are trailing slightly behind and suffering the impact and investing more on prevention and detection after they perceive the threat. What means that potentially better anticipation could help. Next slide, please. Maybe just concluding typology of fraud. Definitely, if we look by industry, the types of fraud are not the same. The most prevalent type of fraud are not the same. Each industry has its own specificities, and in Singapore we didn't have enough data size to meaningfully build a trend. These statistics that you see is from our global population, but I think that it gives you indications that, for example, industries like financial services, government sector, health industries, telecommunications, they suffer from fraud like cybercrime, customer fraud. Why? Because there is data, the traditional target for this type of fraud. And when we are going to different type of business like energy, utilities, resources, bribery and corruption on the top, or you go to more traditional business like manufacturing or industrial products, asset misappropriation, a big classic, which was almost always one of the top crimes in the past. Yeah, then for this kind of industries, there is a top type of fraud. Shabana, next slide, please. Okay, what organizations are doing to fight fraud? I think that here, just quick comment why we group them in these three buckets: corporate controls, corporate culture, and outside of management influence. Historically, we did it because we were trying to understand what is under management control and what is not under management control from the detection point of view. Obviously, corporate controls are fully under management control. Corporate cultures are softer elements which contribute to the detection but are not linked to specific control. For example, culturally, in some organization, people speak up very easily, report whatever wrong around them. In other organization, maybe it is more difficult. But if the people report something wrong that they see around them, typically it will come under the bucket of detection under corporate culture. The good news is that clearly we can perceive the trend that organization took detection of fraud under the control. Corporate controls detection increased dramatically, and this is a very positive news. And what we see in different types of detection behind corporate controls, top detection method is suspicious activity monitoring. And I think that suspicious activity monitoring we can also link with increased investment in digital means and technology. Shabana, next slide, please. We summarized on this slide various technology used by organizations to prevent fraud and to detect fraud. You can see comparative here between Singapore and global. It's orange and gray. And you can see that Singapore is quite well placed, in fact, because on average, Singapore is investing more in technology than the global average. And you see on the bottom the pink and red boxes with percentages. In fact, we asked companies to say, okay, if you use this specific technology, do you find value? And for example, for communication monitoring, 54% of organizations said, yes, we use it. And when we use it, we find value. It is not the highest percentage. We can see that, for example, anomaly detection or transaction testing and monitoring in Singapore, they call for higher value from users. Maybe one area to highlight for you is governance, risk, and compliance solutions. It's one of the areas where Singapore companies are using it less than the global counterparts. But when these companies are using this tool, in fact, 64% find value. Maybe there is something to think about it. Is it any potential development in this area that may be observed? When we're looking into Asia-Pacific landscape, I think that Asia-Pacific as a wider region is often comparable to global or to Singapore, maybe with some specifics in artificial intelligence when there is still a big gap. Artificial intelligence in Asia Pacific is at the global average, when we see Singapore is much more developed and much more invested. Interestingly, on average, organizations across Asia Pacific regions, they report higher percentages of satisfaction of finding value when they use technology. They're around 70% for the same buckets that we can observe in Singapore and reported on this slide. Shabana, next slide, please. I'm conscious of time, and probably I will just highlight some key trends that need to be mindful about the current environment. Definitely, COVID-19 has an impact on the trend in fraud risk. As any change, and is what a lot of changes in for organization in COVID-19 environment, it creates increase in risk. For example, from typical fraud triangle perspective, pressure is definitely high. There are performance issues, there are difficulties to meet KPIs, there are adverse changes in the organization. Definitely, workforce is under pressure. There are also more opportunities, very fast changes in from work from office to work from home. There are disruptions in the market. Definitely, all these changes and the requirement for fast adaptation create gaps in the controls or temporary gaps, and organization need to adapt. And during this time, they are more vulnerable to the threat of fraud. There are also more rationalization by employees who suffer from current environment. They may perceive that the organization treats them unfairly, what will help them to rationalize something what they're doing wrong, and they will not perceive it as really wrong. They will say, okay, but in current environment, maybe the rational, they will find the justification for the action. This is what we observe during the typical pressures on employees and difficulties faced by organization. Definitely, environment is more risky. Next slide, please. In this environment, what fraud can surge? Definitely cybercrime, and I think that there were also already reports about some cyber incidents using the unsecure Wi-Fi hotspots, and a lot of business impersonation techniques where some of them were already reported in the press. We have seen clearly big frauds that were suffered by companies, but quickly dealt with, because these frauds typically are discovered very quickly. Supply chain challenges. Definitely, the companies need to find new ways of managing the supply chain. New third parties. Sometimes these third parties are deceitful. sometimes they propose something substandard or unreal, what means that a lot of supply management challenges need to be faced by organizations. Financial crime is maybe also on the rise because there are a lot of funds contributed by governments and different organizations as a support measures, and there are definitely opportunities for fraud in this area. But there are also with market turmoils and high volatility, there are fraudulent investment opportunities proposed to organizations, to individuals. And obviously, there are still opportunities for internal fraud with internal processes disrupted and changes and not stable yet. There may be opportunities for traditional type of fraud, including accounting fraud. Next slide, please. Yeah, and to conclude, we just would like to give you some ideas about immediate actions that organization can implement when dealing with this kind of changing and challenging environment. First of all, we think that it's focus on changes in risk is important because you cannot do everything. You have limited resources in this kind of environment, what means that clear understanding of what are key risks evolving at this precise point of time may help to focus on bigger risks. Another area is you need to stay realistic because definitely with organizational changes and which come very fast, it's impossible to do structural changes overnight. What means that you need to implement something that is realistically possible. For example, it's impossible to do pre-transaction controls. It should be post-transactional controls that should replace it. Or there are not enough resources, internal audit may need to step in. From an investigation point of view, even if it's challenging, it's usually useful to investigate fast, even if it's small incident, because investigation of the small incident can point to the gap in the internal control, which need to be immediately closed and may help to prevent bigger size incident. If it remains uninvestigated for some time, it may result in reoccurrence and accumulation of fraud losses. And finally, prompt remediation. Yes, it's always challenging to do quick changes in the environment when the focus maybe is on the business, but it's necessary to contribute this available time to obtain immediate improvement when it's possible. Collection of information to plan and implement more structural responses later when it's possible, it's also important. As a minimum, there is information available to analyze the situation and to decide when and how fast certain more structural and more time-consuming adjustments need to be implemented. Shabana, next slide, please. Yeah, I think that with limited time, I finished my presentation. I hope that I gave you some ideas about the trends. Obviously, if you have any question, you can contact us because we are dealing with these matters related to fraud detection and prevention and investigation on a day-to-day basis. We would be really happy to have a discussion with you if you would like to discuss some topics in more details. Yeah, we also have internal resources available to public on our website. You can go in more details of our recent studies about COVID-19 or global economic crime and fraud survey on our website. And you can contact directly us, myself or Piotr, if you would like to have a face-to-face discussion on any topics that may be of interest for you, and I hope that you will be able to reply to a question to help. At this point, I will pass the word of the presentation to Sebastian.
Thank you, Dmitry. I will now ask Sebastian to discuss NetGuardians anti-fraud solutions. Sebastian, all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending today. So what I'm going to talk today is I'm going to talk about NetGuardians, its anti-fraud solution and how it's implemented, but I'm also going to cover certain basics in relation to several questions that they are usually in relation to machine learning and artificial intelligence. We all heard the words, we all have seen the movies, but a lot of people we found across our talking with certain customers, a lot of people really does not actually understand the concepts of what machine learning are, what is AI, the difference between those two, and what machine learning is better than the other one depending on the situation. So it's a really complex discipline, and not everything works everywhere. So there are specific areas and specific problems that you're going to have, and NetGuardians have taken an approach to resolve those problems that I'm going to explain right now. So can you move to the next slide, please, Shabana? So what I'm going to jump directly, it's the area, this is specifically for NetGuardians. These are what you can see in the screen right now are the areas for financial crime. You have a variety of steps when you can detect financial crime, from the moment of account opening, so KYC, customer screening, and transaction screening, which is when you receive a new customer to your organization and you don't know who that people is. And you want to confirm, is this person a real person? Is a potential fraudster? Is someone stealing someone else's identity, and so on? Once you go through all that process, then you have who the customer is a valid person. That person starts to interact with his account, starts to transact, and other people, malicious people, could steal his information or could try to use his data in order to do transactions that are not allowed. So that is a second stage of fraud detection. Can you move to the next slide, please? So NetGuardians plays from the moment that the account has been opened onwards. So specifically NetGuardians as a company, they don't actually have a solution for KYC, customer screening, and transaction screening. There is a reason for this, which I will explain in a minute. The know-how of NetGuardians is in the transactional fraud detection area, which is the account has been opened, the customer is already transacting, and something happened in that interaction that potentially is committing the fraud. Can you move to the next slide, please? So going back to let's do some historical review of the traditional approach of fraud detection versus artificial intelligence itself. What is the traditional approach of fraud detection? It's rules. So this is something that is usually coming from AML, from the anti-money laundering world. So there are certain things in the AML world that they were needed to be checked in order to be compliant to the central bank of every country, and those things were really strict, really specific. Transactions above certain amount of money, transaction goes to certain countries. So those things were really easy and obviously really valuable to be done using business rules. So asking a question for a rule to answer yes or no. If the answer is yes, this is something suspicious that need to be investigated. And this is the way that traditional fraud detection products were created. So you had a fraudster, the fraudster commits certain type of fraud, that there is a human analysis. That means some employee of the organization detected the fraud, or the customer raised an alert, hey, there's money missing from my account. And based on that human analysis, a business rule was created, it was implemented, and after that one you have detection. For the last, I would say, 15 years, a fraud detection system have been working like this one. And essentially they worked. So they were looking for the fraud and they were detecting fraud. But they have many disadvantages that came with the volumes. So the more banks were around, the more transactions were around, popularization of digital channels, more activity from the customers, that created more volume of transactions. And those rules were extremely fixed. And they have disadvantage in the sense that they need to be fine-tuned. Fine-tune a rule is not something easy, so it's not something that you can do pretty quickly. And those rules started to create a lot of false positives. So after years and years of having the same rules, having the implementation of the rule taking a long time, the fine-tuning of the rule taking a long time, the system start giving more and more false positives. They also have another problem, which is they are not predictive. You are only covered by the fraud that you know. So you need to be attacked first, or you need to receive some intel from some other place that tells you this type of fraud is happening, create a rule, put it in place, and then you're covered. So there was no system that could tell you that something may be happening that you don't know about. That is when the part of AI and machine learning came on board. Can you move to the next slide, please? So machine learning and AI apply a different angle. This is the angle that NetGuardians apply. This is what we call a second generation of fraud detection products, being the previous one, the first generation of fraud detection products. Instead of focusing on the fraudster, so the artificial intelligence approach focuses on the customer. And what you're going to do is you're going to identify transactions and behaviors for this customer. Being transactions, any type of monetary activity, monetary transfer that the person is doing, and behaviors, things that the person is doing on their account. Do they use their online banking? Do they log in from the same computer all the time? Are they using their phones? Are they using their computers? Do they actually use their bank account at certain hours? Those are behaviors. There are not monetary transactions. There's no money exchanging hands, but there is activity there. And you can identify abnormal behavioral patterns from that activity. What the systems do is they collect all this information and they create a profile for this client. Now, this client, the more we call entity, can be anything. Can be a customer, can be an ATM, can be a merchant, can be an employee. Because there is a really common pattern of fraud, which is the internal fraud. Your own employees stealing money from accounts. Employees of the banks is doing small transfers in order to fly under the radar and try to not be identified, and in the span of 10 years, stolen $40 million. So that is something that is happening, and that's why it's something that is important to profile. Once you have that one, so those profiles are evaluated by machine learning algorithms. This is the key part of the whole process. Not all the machine learning algorithms are useful for this type of fraud detection. In the same way that not all the same machine learning algorithms are used for the account opening situation. In NetGuardians' case in particular, NetGuardians has created a specific set of machine learning algorithms completely dedicated to transactional fraud detection, and that we know they work. So that is probably the intellectual property that you get from the company. The fact that those models are proven in several parts of the world, and they have been evolved and they are tested. Now, once those machine learning models, the transaction goes through those models, big majority of the transactions will be fine. So they will be okay. So you're expecting a really small amount of transactions to trigger. If no transactions trigger, if the transaction triggers, for any reason, then it creates an alert, and then comes the detection process. The detection process is the human interaction. So it's the fraud reviewer of the organization. The fraud reviewer will look at the transaction, do this investigation, probably call the customer, find out what's going on, and two things may happen. It could be a confirmed fraud. So if effectively the alert is valid and the model has detected the fraud, or it could be a false positive. In both situations, whatever happens, and decision is done, and that retrofits to the model. So the model is continually learning and continually improving. And that is the difference between, probably the main difference between the rules and the machine learning approach. In the rules, every time that you have find something unusual or an activity that does not make really sense, but is valid for that customer, you need to modify a rule, or you need to put that customer in some type of whitelist for that person to not trigger all the time, or you're going to end up with millions of false positives. When you have a machine learning model that retrofits, like this case, what it will happen is the first time it will be alerted, an investigation will happen. The investigation outcome will be, this is a false positive. The model will learn that for that profile, that activity is not unusual anymore, and it will actually not trigger the next time. That is done automatically, so you don't need to have someone maintaining rules. That reduces the amount of false positives, reduces the need of maintenance, and makes the whole thing much more efficient. With the new era of volume of transactions, it's unmanageable to keep on having rules-based systems. So you need to move to something more sophisticated nowadays, because otherwise you're going to end up having a massive team of reviewers to try to control all your false positives. And you're going to see it pretty quickly. You're going to have more than 50% of false positive. That is actually makes no sense. And it does not allow you to grow as a business. Next slide, please. So again, specifically talking about NetGuardians, there are three areas where NetGuardians focus. One is digital banking fraud, so the classic activity done from online banking and mobile banking. So anything involving logins, activities from certain phone, computers, geopositioning, etc. The second area is enterprise for payment fraud. This is anything involving money transfers. So any activity done through a payment or through a transfer to some in the country or outside the country in order to identify an abnormal pattern there. The third one, which is something that is one of the most popular in the region, is internal fraud, which is an employee of the bank for years on years and years stealing money from the customers that probably you don't know anything about it. So if you work in a bank, I can guarantee you that right now in this moment, you have an employee that is stealing money from you. You're not going to find it right now. Maybe you'll find it next year, and then it will actually make the news. Because when you do the math of how much the guy has stole in all these years, if you don't have an internal fraud solution to detect him, will be millions. And you see those news in the newspaper from different countries every 2 or 3 weeks. There's some employee found in some bank that has been stealing money for 5, 6, 7 years. So that is something that is happening, and it's quite predominant that we have seen, because banks usually don't have this type of solutions to detect this type of behaviors. And some people think that because they haven't actually found it, that doesn't exist. But it's something to keep an eye on in case that you don't have it. Next slide, please. So what are the strategies that are detected to combine to detect fraud? So something that NetGuardians has, but it's actually not mandatory to have, but some people still going to have, is what is called pattern-based intelligence, which is essentially the business rules. So business rules, even when you have machine learning and profiling, will get rid of the majority of the rules. You still, every implementation, you still see 3 or 4 rules running around to detect certain things. Sometimes a blacklist, sometimes certain particular scenario. What it will happen is every time that I have seen that we modify, that we change a rules-based product from our product, you end up changing hundreds of rules for 5 rules. And the rest, the machine learning models and the profiling takes care of the rest. The other 2 components of the detection strategy is what I was talking before. So the dynamic profiling and the machine learning. So the profiling, remember, is the profile, the activity of the entity. And the machine learning models is what compares the transaction versus the profile. And it tells you that this transaction looks unusual. Does it have any type of information that may not look right? And that one, in the case that happens, it's actually true. Can we see the same slide, please? Next slide, please. All right, so I'm not going to get really technical here, but I'm just going to talk about 2 types of machine learning models. And this is the part of the explanation of what is AI, what is machine learning, and why not all the machine learning and not all the AI is the same. Artificial machine learning is a discipline inside artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence has many disciplines. Machine learning is one of them. The capability of a computer to think based on experience. Now, then inside machine learning, there are several techniques that are applied. One is called, usually used for fraud detection, unsupervised machine learning. Unsupervised machine learning is what it uses for predictiveness. It's what is trying to tell you some information about new things that you haven't actually found yet. So that is something that used for prediction processes. Can you move to the next slide, please? So then you have supervised techniques. Supervised technique is quite the opposite, which is the ability of train the model to explain things that you know about. This is what is used to replace rules. And a supervised technique is essentially the classic implementation of machine learning that generates the results, similar results to what you get with rules. Next slide, please. So what will happen? If you only apply supervised learning, as the majority of the machine learning products do, then you're going to end up with a problem called overfitting. Overfitting means that you are having the same results that you were having with rules, because the model only picks up what you are telling them to pick up. So it's only going to identify the fraud that you know about. In NetGuardians, what we do is we combine both systems, unsupervised and supervised learning. Both of those systems are actually combined together in order to tell you the fraud that you don't know about yet and the fraud that you know about. So you get the results that you knew, and you add to that one the results that you didn't know about yet. So you got the predictiveness and the fraud that you already knew about. The fraud that you have reported before, plus the new fraud that you may not be aware. And that will give you the best of both worlds. Low false positives, because you are actually cleaning up the extra information, and new frauds. So that's why the models and the type of models that you use are so important. Not every machine learning model will detect fraud efficiently. Most of them probably will detect fraud, but not efficiently. And you're going to end up with the same problem that you had with rules. Next slide, please. So, sorry, next one. This already talked about this one. Now, how do we do this in NetGuardians? We combine different sources of information. So this a combination of different channels, IT layers, and transactions is what we give to the model in order for the model to be efficient. Now, it may be that customers may have or may not have that data, depending on the level of efficiency that they have in the system, or they will have really messy data. That happens in 99% of the cases. 99% of the situations, we found that the data is a mess. So there is some cleanup that we can do there, and there is some value that we can get from that information anyway. So that is something that is really common for us. Next one, please. So the results are displayed in a way, in a graphical way for the reviewer to see it. Can you show me the next slide, please? This is a little bit, you can see it better here. So this one is the way that the reviewer will see the results in the screen. So what is going to happen is, what you're going to see here is on the top left side is the alert level of this particular transaction. So this transaction is a 90% alert, which means that it's actually kind of risky. We will work with each one of the customers to define what do they consider something risky. Could be that they have a really low threshold, so they want to be really risk averse, so they want to trigger a lot just to ensure they're not missing any fraud. Or it could be that they only want to trigger the amount of fraud, the things that are really, really risky. So they're just going to pick up the things with high fraud. Now, there is a really common situation that we face again when we talk about that we implement AI and machine learning, that is explainability. We need to be able to show that the product is not a black box. So how do we do that? How do we explain to someone that is coming audit this specific fraud team, why are you reviewing this transaction? And that is the red bars that you have at the bottom of the screen. So each one of those lines and each one is a data characteristic. And if you can see there, there's beneficiary institution, there's company, there's a beneficiary amount, etc. And they have a value from 0 to 100%. That means the higher the number of the percentage, the more unusual that characteristic is. For example, if I am transferring money to a country that I never transferred before in my life, that would be 100% characteristic. So that characteristic is really unusual. If I transfer money to the same bank that I transfer every day, obviously that will be 0%. The more unusual characteristics you have, the higher the risk score you're going to get at the top. And each one of the characteristics have a different weight. So some data characteristics have more relevance for fraud detection than other ones. So what is going to happen is, if anybody asks you, what is the reason why you're reviewing this specific transaction? Okay, why the machine learning model triggered this as unusual? Yeah, it's because the beneficiary institution is unusual, the company is unusual, the amount is unusual. So this person transferred money to a bank that they never transferred before, to another company that they never transferred before, from an amount that they don't usually transfer, from a computer that they don't usually use, etc. So the combination and the aggregation of all those values make the model to trigger this doesn't look right. It could be a valid transaction, but looks really unusual, worthy to be investigated. And that's why even when we have AI and even when we have machine learning, it's really easy to explain why the transaction triggered. And that's why you can actually rely on something like this, and you can fine-tune something like this because you know what's exactly pointing out. So I think we're running a little bit of time. So Shabana, I don't know if you want to jump into your section.
Sure, Sebastian. Thank you. So let me move on to the last section of today's presentations. I will very quickly discuss how we're working with the financial institutions and some of the features or the functionalities that we feel are important for organizations. Okay? Sebastian talked about the rule-based approaches and explained in detail, right? So rule-based approaches are probably the oldest ones. Rules are difficult and time-consuming to implement, as it includes the painstaking definition of every single rule for anomaly detection. But the most important point is that traditional systems are by definition reactive, since they can only generate alerts based on previous rules. We believe rules can have a place, but the fraud solution should not rely solely on rules. In order to combat a wide array of fraud attempts today, we should think of a combination of rules with machine learning algorithms. We all know that criminals are getting smarter and, ironically, are leveraging advances in technology for their own benefit. Banks have to keep up with advanced technology to fight criminal gangs. That's why we use multiple detection strategies to detect fraud instead of relying exclusively on one. The best technology for fighting fraud is one that can change and adapt, I would say, as quickly as the fraudsters' tactics. Increasingly, organizations are embracing machine learning and AI for fraud detection. And when designed properly, they learn, they adapt, and they uncover emerging patterns of fraud. Some institutions are even trying to develop their own machine learning models and their own systems. What we've learned is that they often find it a long and challenging process due to the shortage of data scientists, which is expected to continue. Secondly, what we're hearing is that most data scientists are spending anywhere between 10 to 20% of their time on AI and 80% of their time finding, cleaning, and reorganizing huge amounts of data, which is an inefficient data strategy. Basically, a quarter of data science capability is lost to infrastructure tasks. Given this background, we would say banks need to look for vendors that have experience in this space, can provide fraud detection and prevention capability quickly with pre-developed risk models, which will help banks to focus on their core strengths while leveraging the core strengths of the fraud vendors. Okay? It's incredible to see how many big data projects fail and organizations are unable to take advantage of the power of big data for their fraud detection projects. One of the main reasons is data. And by that, I mean data extraction, cleaning, enriching, remodeling it for banking use cases as it's an enormous project, right? Secondly, technical mastery alone is not sufficient for big data projects to succeed. Implementing data analytics use cases for fraud prevention requires a strong involvement from business experts as well. Often people think that putting a large number of data scientists on a project will do the job. However, data scientists without a clear understanding of the business context cannot achieve success in our view. Deploying big data technologies for fraud prevention is taking organizations anywhere from 12 to 24 months, right? NetGuardians is working with financial institutions to deploy fraud prevention solutions on big data within a few months. So how do we do it? Our data collection framework builds a consistent view of transactional and user behavior across functional silos, and I would say individual components of the information system. Our technology makes it possible to integrate and exploit any kind of data from any kind of system, regardless of the underlying technology. We have an agnostic core banking approach. Solution fits easily into various banking architectures for any core banking platform or database. Okay? And it helps to extract data. And our multi-competency team works together to identify right use cases for banks and make big data projects painless to bring banks added value. Generally, machine learning models are considered to be black boxes, and Sebastian also talked about this, right? It is often very difficult, if not impossible, to explain to the decision makers how the model came to the score or the conclusion it did. But explaining the what and how for machine learning systems is critical, but particularly in high regulated industries like financial services. This explainability factor is often referred to as whiteboxing, and it is critical for governance processes. Banks need to explain how algorithms arrive at certain decisions to all stakeholders, including regulators. These explanations need to be made in a timely and consistent manner. Without acceptable explanations, any insights or black box approaches to AI can cause concerns about model bias, accountability, and so on. We believe that explainable AI increases the transparency of AI solutions and outcomes. It reduces regulatory as well as reputational risk. At NetGuardians, we provide full business context for each alert raised so that system alerts can be easily understood, appropriate follow-up actions can be taken, and where and when required, these actions can be explained. The concept of augmented intelligence is centered around the fact that artificial intelligence is capable of helping human capabilities rather than replacing them. You'll need human supervision to decide whether you are dealing with a false positive or negative. Machine learning doesn't replace the fraud analyst team, but gives them the ability to reduce the time spent on manual reviews and data analysis. This means analysts can focus on the most urgent cases and assess alerts faster. Machine learning makes the role of fraud analysts more efficient as their time is freed up to do more strategic work. One study cited by a White House report during the Obama administration found that while machines had a 7.5% error rate in reading radiology images and humans had a 3.5% error rate, when humans combined their work with machines, the error rate dropped to 0.5%. So what this tells us is that augmented intelligence built on the concept that humans and machines can work collectively achieve better results. Keeping this in mind, we provide forensic tools to banks to clearly understand the rationale, the logic behind the alerts raised by the machine so that humans can easily follow up and decide on the appropriate course of action. This way, humans and machines work together in the fight against fraud. Fraud prevention is difficult because fraudsters constantly adapt. The moment you figure out how to stop one scam, a new one surfaces, right? So there's no single machine learning algorithm that works best. Success comes from the ability to try lots of different techniques and using them with many data sets. This requires a variety of supervised and unsupervised machine learning methods. So through supervised machine learning, AI is able to interpret trend-based insights, which joined by completely new knowledge gained through unsupervised machine learning makes it possible for AI to determine whether a transaction is fraudulent or not. As you can see on this slide, criminals are offering fraud as a service. thus making it easier for individuals to commit fraud by hiring them, whether individuals themselves can do it or not. That's not an issue anymore. NetGuardians managed learning technology doesn't endlessly learn about any given type of fraud, and this avoids overfitting the system, which Sebastian talks about, and makes it more, I would say, dynamic, capable of spotting new types of fraud. So this is the last slide. I'll just leave it over there to give you an idea that NetGuardians is working with over 60 customers around the world to address the evolving challenges facing the institutions. I hope you learned something today about the market and the key aspects, the features that one should look for in a fraud solution to provide you with the right protection. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. That's all we wanted to cover today. Let's have some questions and answers now. Here's the first question. How will audit trail be handled for dynamic profiling machine learning component? What they mean is that how will the user explain to regulators what the system is doing? Sebastian, do you want to take this question?
Yes, I can. So that will be done through the dashboards that the reviewer will have access to. So the machine learning model will do the comparison of data of abnormalities in the data points of the transaction versus the profile of a regular customer. And all that information, all the things that look unusual will be expressed in the dashboards. So when you hit the dashboards and you see all the information that you have there, you will clearly going to be able to point out what's the reason why the transaction was alerted. It's because certain characteristics do not make sense for that customer behavior. Usually, one characteristic is not enough to trigger an alert. They have to be a combination of a few. But if it is a characteristic which is really important, something like amount, for example, the customer never transfers such a big figure, and at some point when they did it, it could potentially be alerted.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Here's the second question. In the APAC region, what are the countries with the highest occurrence of reported fraud incidents? Maybe a question for Dmitry?
Yes, thank you, Shabana. Yeah, it's a very good question because based on our survey, two biggest countries with highest level of reported fraud are China and India. And it means a lot for organizations doing business in the region. Definitely China and India, big economic players. A lot of companies have business relationship, cross-border trade relations with organizations from these countries. What means that given the high risk of fraud in these countries, potentially when dealing with organizations from these countries or when doing business in these countries, the vigilance should be increased and fraud prevention enhanced.
Thank you, Dmitry. Maybe we have time for one last question. What should an organization do to emerge stronger from a fraud incident? Dmitry, would you like to take that again?
Yes. To emerge stronger, it's definitely it's a complex question because we can imagine that fraud is always a stressful time for an organization and a lot of pressure. But I think that one of the first point I would say is that to emerge stronger, this event should be seen as an opportunity for improving organization and to prevent reoccurrence of such event in the future. It means that structurally any incident, not only fraud incident, is approached as a potential for improving processes, improving organization, and improving preparedness if such event can recur in the future. That means organization and forward-looking positioning of internal control are important. If an organization would like to prepare for fraud and invest, its preparedness is important. When an organization is ready, based on our studies, when an organization prepared and invested in this plan for response to the fraud, typically organizations spend less money as compared to the organizations who did not invest in fraud preparedness. And also emerging stronger require more structured approach. If organization prepared in advance, they know exactly when something happens, who is responsible to make the team, who need to step in, external advisors, if necessary, lawyers need to be called in. Faster it happens, higher is the chance to recover what is at risk during the fraud event. And also better is the chance that through analysis of root causes, identification of what did not work, who did the wrong, the weak spots in the organization will be identified and corrected. And going forward, organization will be more effective in dealing with fraud risk.
Okay, thank you, Dmitry. That's all the time we have for today's session. I hope you found the session useful and helped address some of your concerns or questions that you may have. If you didn't get the chance to ask your question, please send us an email and we'll get back to you with the answers. We will also send you the link to the recording. A number of institutions from the region has joined us for this webinar today. So thank you all. And thank you, Dmitry and Sebastian, for sharing your insights with our audience. Hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.